All right, hi. Just a quick run through to kind of like this group task for today, or this topic of this week, which is additional research, right? We are trying to figure out, okay, part of your group work is to deliver, or if you want to have a first, then you need to bring in a little bit additional research. I think I want to just highlight this again, that this should be in some ways the last thing you should do. You should start by looking at the lectures. You should start by looking at the literature and the readings that are on Moodle for each of the weeks, right? Don't reinvent the wheel. Don't start with additional research. But I think it's really good, and I think it's like to think about it, and I think it's really good to kind of work on that skill, to find really good research and bring it in. You will do this in all of your other third-year coursework as well. And so let's work on that. And I might be able to teach you a little bit about the field of psychology along the way. So what do we think about additional research, right? I think when you do additional research, it should be something that extends what you say, right? Not simply say the same thing. So sometimes students do it in a not optimal way, where they basically would add another study that says the same thing. You can say, oh, if you find something like that, you feel like, well, that doesn't really add anything. You're just like, oh, here, see another replication by Kappes and Yearsley 2022, right? That would be a way. But do not kind of look especially for things that say the same thing, but do for things that extend it. Have a replication in a different country, different sample, look at a different like a different facet, to look at a different moderator, a mechanism, a mediator, and so forth, right? You know the spiel. It should ideally be empirical studies, and describe them a little bit when you write about that. So I think it's not really good to kind of go for another chapter or something like that. That's not good additional research. It should be research, and it should be ideally empirical studies. You might look for something that exactly look at the problem. So think about, let's say, we talked in week 2 or 3 about FaceLook. Let's just call it Facebook for now. And if they're interested in self-enhancement, and maybe somebody has Facebook and self-enhancement already studied, and I bet they did. So then you can exactly add that and kind of add that perspective to it. It should be 100% from a peer-reviewed journal. A peer-reviewed journal means a journal where the publications are only published when other researchers approved it and said, this is sound research and the things that are in there are good, okay? That's peer review. So if James Yearsley submits a paper and I become his reviewer, then I anonymously read his paper and think, is this good, is this not? Does this make sense? Does that make sense? With all my knowledge, I bring in there to criticize and provide feedback to the paper. And another person does that too, and an editor does that. Sometimes it's 3 or 4 reviewers. And then you have to go through revisions, and then it gets published. And obviously, the better the journal, and we come back to that in a second, the more rigorous that review process is, okay? Don't go for research which is like 1972. I always think like I read that, it's like, oh, 1972, they found that. Often I feel like, well, it's kind of like a different world than 50 years ago. What happened in the meantime? The research in that area was not as good as it is today. I at least hope that we made some progress. So just kind of make sure that you're not doing citing or having additional research is like super old, okay? How best to start it? I think you should always start with Google Scholar. Just go to Google Scholar and have a look, okay? Especially if you feel a little bit more comfortable with the topics, with the names. If you look out for names that I mentioned in my lectures, if you know the big names in the field, you will know them because you just wrote about their research from the textbook, from the additional article, but mostly from the lectures, right? So you know Fiss, Cuddy, Click, Ash, blah, 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 right? But like Google Scholar is the best. I always start on Google Scholar and then just look if the PDF is directly linked to it. I think it's a really good way to start. You can also search for references that cite the article. And then you see, for instance, if you have something from 1972, you just click on look who cites that. And then you see, oh, who has cited that in the last 2 years? Do they find the same thing? So it's super easy to get one, right? I think the other alternative, somebody in our talk on Monday mentioned PubMed. PubMed is specifically more clinical and medical. So I used it when I worked in health psychology as a research assistant during my undergrad studies. I used a lot of PubMed, but it's very health oriented. I think one thing that's really, really good is PsycInfo, which is a database that has only psychological articles from the APA, from the American Psychology Association. And so you will only get really good or relatively good quality articles there. So you won't end up in the International Journal of European Sociology, which then tells us something completely outrageous. I think then, okay, if it's not on Google Scholar, go to the City Library to see it. But most articles now are pretty easy to get online, so that shouldn't be a real problem. The biggest suggestion, the biggest kind of tip I would give you, start reading. Most students don't start reading. They think, oh, I need to find this. If you find a good article, for instance, on an article, like I think today we talk about attitudinal ambivalence. If you find one good article, they often have everything you're looking for already in there. They will talk about the importance of that. They will talk about different applications. They will make a case for why this is really interesting. If there are negative consequences, they will also kind of name positive consequences. So you can kind of like spot read it, you can skim them, and you can very easily get a really good impression of the field, but just reading one or two good articles, okay? So don't wait for the perfect reference to come along, but instead find one, especially one in a journals I will show you in a second, and use that one, okay? So what are great journals to start with? This is really important to kind of know, right? Sometimes I feel like students think like, oh, I found it in a journal article and now it must be true. Or I can treat it in my essay as if this is something that's correct, right? And then I look at it, it's like, oh, this is a surprising finding. And I look at the finding, it's like, it's a terrible journal, which is like kind of like either a journal where it's like, you have to pay to get in, it's not really peer reviewed, or it doesn't get any good peer review because so low at the bottom of the kind of publishing hierarchy. So it's hard to say that, right? There's some good, really good articles and really bad journals on that I consider not very good. But in general, I think the quality of the article is really good to judge based on kind of like, or it's a really good indicator of the quality of the article if you find it in the right journal. What are right journals? The best journals in science, obviously, are Nature and Science, right? I think highest impact factor. So they have the, you can Google for each journal, like the impact factor, and then you see how much they influence other people. This is the metric we use in order to rank our like journals in science, right? Nature and Science, there are very few psychological publications, really top kind of journals that are not specifically psychology are Nature Human Behavior, Nature Neuroscience, and Nature Communications. These are like places where I have also published and I try to publish. They have a lot of psychological content, massive impact factors. PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, is another kind of general. So if you find an article in one of these on your topics, just read that. That will be a great one. I mean, Nature and Science are often just a page or two long. These Nature Human Behavior, Nature Neuroscience, Nature Communications, and PNAS are longer. Okay. So then we have this like in all science, what is about our psychology, the kind of two flagships are here of psychological science, right? And it's affiliated journals. So there's Perspective in Psychological Science, and there is Psychological Science in the Public Interest. These are all three really, really good journals. And if you find something like, if you look for instance attitudinal ambivalence and you find something either in Psych Science or in Journal of Experimental Psychology General, there are others that are like memory, blah blah blah, learning and memory, and something like lower versions that are not as good. You look for the general, JEP General, we say in psychology. Really good article. And I think here the articles in JEP General often is a little bit longer, so you get a lot of meat. Okay. And then the best journals in social psychology. The flagship journal is what we call JPSP, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. I think has a massive impact factor for social psychology or for psychology in general. The good thing is the style of that, like psych science, psychological science, for instance, has a relatively short articles, more fun to read, but you often don't get as much information. If you find an article on your topic that you're interested in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, this is the place to start, because you will get a really quality introduction, a really quality discussion. So only skimming these two will give you massive amounts of information. Journal of Experimental Social Psychology and Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin are two journals I published in. I quite like them both, a long tradition. A relatively new one of social psychological and personality science. This is basically kind of like an affiliated journal of psychological science, but grew very quickly popular. European Journal of Social Psychology, also pretty okay. Everything that has a European in front of it is a little like, it's not as good as the ones that try to be worldwide. Social psychology is another one. And then the British journal, everything that's just kind of for one country, you should always kind of, have like look at it a little bit cautiously, okay? These are good journals. You can look at them, but I think you should kind of see if you find first something in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, then want something in Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin. These are the ones I would start definitely beforehand. Okay. I hope this is helpful. Here's some other tips. I think if you evaluate these articles, use your knowledge and understanding. Don't just say like, oh, look, this article that I found contradicts everything Andreas was saying in the lecture and that I've read so far, but hey, there it is, it's an article. No, use your brain, okay? Yeah, if the research is old, I already mentioned it, look what happened in the meantime. You can do that in Google Scholar and follow the trail thereby. Really good. It's like all of these things will come in really handy when you do your dissertation. And so just to remember, it's like, just because it's a peer-reviewed journal, does not mean it is true. The likelihood is simply higher, right? But you still need to use your critical faculties and not just kind of say whatever the author says and follow along what they think is right. Okay, use your own critical faculties to evaluate the article. Okay, have fun with the group work and talk to you soon.